All right, good morning. It's great to be here at Stanford. After getting rejected as an undergrad, rejected again for grad school, but hey, I got invited back to be on a panel, so worked out all right. So as I mentioned, I am the CEO and founder of a company called Axon now. It used to be Taser. We recently changed our name because we're doing some things beyond the electrical weapons that the Taser name fits. Real quick, I'm going to talk a little bit about our background, get a little bit of flavor of how we think about police technology. Our mission is, by the end of my life, I want to look back and see that bullets are obsolete. I view the idea of killing as a technology limitation. And I think you actually heard that nuance from the chief. They don't train police to shoot to kill. They train them to shoot to stop. And the way that they stop a threat is, unfortunately, by killing them. And I think that's because we do not yet have the technology that can outperform a pistol. But it will be here within a decade. Mark my words, and I'll be back in 10 years. You can hold me accountable. How did I get into this space? Well, when I was the age of some of you here, I was in grad school. I was living in Belgium. Two of my friends were shot and killed back in the US. And I became very interested in the topic of gun violence in particular. And as I always started to research this project, or this problem, I came across this guy. His name was Jack Cover. He was a 73-year-old scientist, actually was one of the chief scientists on the Apollo project in the 1960s. And he had invented this electrical weapon called a taser back in the 1960s, which, by the way, a little bit of trivia for you. A taser is an acronym for Tom Swift and his electric rifle. So T-A-S-E-R, Thomas A. Swift's electric rifle is where the name comes from. This was actually science fiction from, I believe, the 1930s that had inspired Jack in the 1960s. Basically, the taser is a handheld device that fires out two wires. To be crude about it, they're jumper cables. And we then connect electricity into the nervous system of the subject with the idea of, instead of stopping a threat by blowing holes in people, by destroying tissue, weapons historically basically work by either killing you or causing significant injury. Our goal is to do this by causing incapacitation. It's certainly not fun. I sometimes liken it to chemotherapy. If you have cancer, it's not a pleasant experience, but it can save your life. The same thing is really true here. And it's funny, actually Taser's been so widely used now, and we've gotten so much public exposure that people tend to have very polar opinions about it, because you tend to hear about the cases where things go wrong. And a lot of times people say, man, tasers sure are dangerous. If you actually look at the data, firearms have a 50% chance of killing you, and the other half of the time they leave life-altering injuries. We go down traditional batons, punches, kicks, hitting people hurts them. This is actual data from the US Department of Justice, a separate study by a major insurance company, and a separate study by the Department of Defense, all iterating tasers have an injury rate about 2 injuries per 1,000. The challenge is, it's new, and the fact using electricity inherently touches to our innate fears, and this leads to a lot of sort of speculation. I liken it a little bit to the speculation about how dangerous Teslas were when there were a few battery fires. But if you actually compare the safety record of the Tesla to everything we're used to, combustion engines, it's like 2 orders of magnitude safer. So similarly, the weapons we all accept today, things like batons, well, heck, we've been using it since we were cavemen. They're actually pretty darn injurious. This is a typical taser injury. I've been shot 7 times myself. It's, again, not fun, not something I want to do on a regular basis. Sometimes you got to lead from the front, and I can tell you about the safety all day long, or I can just show you the videos. So at this point, we have around 1 million weapons deployed globally, and our medical advisory board actually worked with the University of Minnesota and has concluded that 180,000 cases where lethal force could have been legally used by police have been avoided with this technology. So I'm actually pretty proud of the progress we've made. But as I said, today, the firearm is still the primary weapon of self-defense because these alternative, less lethal technologies have not yet reached the level of maturity and reliability to where they're outperforming pistols, but will happen within a decade. All right, heard one of the previous speakers talk about body cameras. We got into body cameras about 10 years ago, frankly, because tasers are so darn controversial. We said we can either argue with people about how police are using it, or let's monitor how they're using it. So we started doing body cameras about 10 years ago, and they've had a pretty significant impact, increasing transparency, decreasing complaints, and we actually see it does alter the behavior of police officers with use of force typically coming down pretty dramatically. Turns out when officers are wearing a camera, they behave a little more carefully, but also so do the people they interact with. Now, there have been a few studies that have actually shown use of force has gone up, but when you actually dig in behind the data, what's happening is police officers are now reporting everything, whereas historically, if you sort of gave a light shove to a police officer, they might ignore it because they don't want to go through the extra paperwork of reporting it. Once it's caught on video, reporting tends to go up. In fact, Cambridge University just did a recent study where across agencies representing 2,000 officers in the UK and the United States, they saw a 93% average drop in complaints. Pretty dramatic. Now, whether that's because a lot of complaints against police were maybe false, or police are behaving better, nobody knows for sure, but we're seeing a pretty dramatic reduction. Now, statistics are one thing, but maybe I should show you an incident, because that obviously speaks to us more as human beings. So I'm going to show you an incident of a white officer that shot and killed a black man in Baltimore in the past month. Now, this is a tragic incident to be sure. However, this could have been tragic on a citywide scale. We've all seen what happened in Baltimore with some of the riots and the public distrust. The first reports of this came out and said that the police had shot and killed an unarmed man in the back as he was running from police. Let me show you the body camera video. So we'll slow it down there. You can see a gun in the guy's hand, and you see he's raising it and pointing it at the officer. And the officer ultimately deploys lethal force. So I don't want to make light of the fact that human life was just taken. That is not the point. But many lives could have been taken if not for the ability to show in a transparent way, here's what that officer was facing when he or she made that decision. Now, there have also been cases where officers have made bad decisions caught on video. I'm aware of a number of cases where there is a higher level of accountability happening now, where officers are now in different careers because these types of technologies were able to intercede. I know in Phoenix, Arizona, there was at least one officer who had some pretty aggressive behavior that was caught on video before he was involved in a lethal force incident, and they were able to move him out of policing. The real challenge around cameras, though, isn't the cameras themselves. It's really, I love the statement earlier, this is really a data challenge. Because when you're deploying thousands of body cameras, you're collecting massive amounts of data. So as we approached this, we realized, sort of like the music player industry of the late 1990s, the hardware was the easy part. It's how do you manage the content on and off in an integrated way with the hardware. So we actually made a pivot to go from being a weapons company to a cloud software provider by pairing body cameras with cloud software. Because it turns out, in the United States, we tend to think of the police as a monolithic, these are the agents of government. Well, the fact is, they're agents of your local city government. There are 18,000 police departments across the United States. The average police department size is 50 people, and most of them have 0 technology professionals or IT staff. It may be somewhere else in the city. So in fact, trying to deploy something as complicated as a major video evidence management system is pretty hard. So we've watched what's happening in other industries and realized for law enforcement to actually deploy new technology, they need help. You need to, much like we as consumers, don't install servers at our house. We use cloud-based systems, whether it's from Facebook to Instagram to Dropbox. So we brought that same model into law enforcement. And then more recently, and this will lead into some of the more interesting controversial stuff, we made 2 acquisitions in artificial intelligence. Because this is data, how do you draw inferences and information out of that data? Now, I would say, as soon as we announced this, of course, there were many people concerned about that we would immediately deploy this for facial recognition technology, enabling Orwellian Big Brother behavior from the government. I would just caution a little bit as you hear these things. We form our perceptions many times from the arts, and people generally have a perception that police have really advanced surveillance technology or other technology. But the fact of the matter is, again, police are generally an agency of your local city government. You're far more likely to see a typewriter in a police department than any sort of crazy tracking technology. In fact, just last year, or maybe it's 2 years ago now, the NYPD, the New York City Council, passed a resolution to ban typewriters at the NYPD. Because NYPD put in $1 million in their budget to refresh their fleet of typewriters. So in fact, I would argue, I think one of the bigger risks is not that police are racing ahead of us with surveillance technology. The bigger risk, in my opinion, is that police are trying to police in 2017, frequently with technology from the last century. And so it's important that they have some agility to be able to move forward. So as we think about the opportunity where we would deploy AI with body cameras, if you actually look at what police do by day, on average, police spend about 2/3 of their time on paperwork. Right? We've all seen in the TV shows, they're complaining about all the paperwork they do, but it turns out that sucks up the majority of their time taking officers off the street from doing community policing. We see the opportunity as, well, wait a minute, if we're recording these incidents, we needed a lot of paperwork 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, because that was the only record you could have. Well, if we're recording it, all the information we need for police reports is buried inside of these videos. Let's use AI to extract it out. And rather than turning police officers into RoboCop, which is, again, a thing I tend to hear, we actually think technology well deployed can make police more human by automating all the tasks that prevent them from focusing on interacting in the communities in a more transparent way. So I'll wrap by saying we actually survey our customers, and police officers pretty universally will tell you they have far more advanced technology at home as a consumer than they have at work. Many agencies we deal with are deploying older laptops that are still running Windows XP. And for some of you in the room who may have never worked on Windows XP, it was an early version that's been out of support for about a decade. And I would say, one of the things we're going to discuss is how do we monitor the police to make sure they're using technology in a good way? How do we measure it? I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian here and say that is important. However, we also need to make sure we do it in a way that allows some agility. And what I'm pointing out here in the United Kingdom, they have a very rigorous scientific process to approve new technology before police can use it. But the practical result of that can be somewhat limiting. For example, they just approved the latest version of the Taser in the UK in 2017. This device was launched in 2011, and so it took 6 years to get through the approval process. Meanwhile, the main advantage of this technology is it actually gives police a second shot if they miss with the first one. And we've seen 878 cases where people have died, they've been shot and killed by police, when the first shot fails. So actually having a second shot is a really important safety improvement. So if you talk to the police officers in the UK, this has actually prevented them from being able to move forward. So I think there's a balance of how do we have good, rigorous oversight, yet maintain some level of ability for police agencies to adopt technology on a faster time horizon. And with that, I'll wrap up and pass to the next speaker and look forward to the Q&A portion.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know so far about how this technology is working. I think it's really important to kind of step back and, as we've been talking about so far today, realize that it wasn't that long ago that we really only had two law enforcement tools available to us. We had police and prisons. And that's rapidly changing. So we've got DNA databases and tasers and electronic monitoring and predictive policing and blood alcohol content monitors that can show you on your phone what your BAC is. It can also send it to your parole officer. Body-worn cameras and a variety of apps and reporting platforms that aim to reduce the incidence of campus sexual assault. And these technologies and a variety of others are all really exciting. This is why I study this. It's really fun and interesting to think about all the ways that technology can be a game changer in a space that I think everyone across the political spectrum agrees needs a lot of change. But I'm an economist, and so my role in these conversations is to bring everyone down. And it's the dismal science, after all. And so I have two pieces of bad news to add to the conversation today. There are lots of potential benefits from these technologies, but the big question is, what are the actual benefits when they're implemented? There are also a lot of potential costs. There are financial costs. If these things work, they can be very cost effective, but they're certainly not free. There are opportunity costs, both in terms of what we could be spending that money on instead, as well as the time involved in training officers on these different tools and policies related to them. There are also privacy costs. So a lot of the tools I showed on the previous slide can be broadly considered surveillance. So they work by increasing the probability that offenders get caught, which means they work by keeping better tabs on all of us all the time. There are also inevitably unintended consequences. It's really rare that a policy works exactly the way we'd hoped when we dreamed it up, and so it's really important to know what the real world effects are on victims' behavior, on criminal behavior, and law enforcement behavior. So what do we know about whether the benefits are worth the costs in this area? Unfortunately, at this point, we have absolutely no idea. So I'm going to talk about 4 examples, 4 case studies of tools that some folks have thought a little bit about to give you some examples about what some of the challenges are here. So the first example I have is DNA databases. So the policy problem these databases are trying to address is we want to quickly and accurately match crime scene evidence to offenders. Obviously, police have been doing this for centuries, but we think that science can do it better. And so DNA databases gather the DNA profiles of people arrested or convicted of crimes, put them in a database, and constantly compare them with crime scene evidence to make matches. The cost of these databases in terms of finance, the monetary cost is really low. So collecting a DNA sample and analyzing it from an offender is about $40. But there are potential privacy costs. I tend to think these are pretty limited relative to other policies like putting cameras everywhere. But the government is collecting genetic material from the population, and so some people get very concerned about that. But I have research in both the US and Denmark showing that there are really big benefits here. So if you compare offenders who are released just before and after these laws go into effect, so you have very similar people who get out, who are not in the database, compare them with people who are in the database. Being added to the DNA database, because you now know you're much more likely to get caught for a crime, your likelihood of recidivating falls dramatically. So in Denmark, we find that DNA profiling reduces recidivism by 25%. In the US, it's by 17%. And we can use those numbers to quantify a cost savings of about $1,500 in avoided crime for each DNA profile. So those are the kinds of numbers I think we'd ideally like to have for all these different tools. Let's talk about body-worn cameras. So here the policy problem is that we want to reduce the use of force by police and make officers more accountable for their behavior. Here their costs are not so small. Each camera is between $300 and $1,000 based on my best internet research, although Axon has recently decided to make the cameras free, at least during the first year, and that's partly because the big money's in data storage. So a police department that wants to adopt these cameras pays about $100 per camera per month to manage and store the data in the cloud. So if a force has about 200 cameras, they'd be paying $240,000 a year for that. That doesn't include the staff time to review the footage. And you could imagine if you want the footage to be publicly available to increase accountability, that cost can add up very quickly. So what do we know about the benefits? The good news is that body-worn cameras are an exception here. There have been really great studies. Body-worn cameras have been rolled out in randomized controlled trials in a number of jurisdictions. So we have really good evidence on what the impact is on use of force. As Rick mentioned, the evidence has been somewhat mixed there. I'll push back a little bit on his interpretation that the evidence that the cameras are increasing use of force is all reporting. I don't think that's at all clear, and there are some good reasons to think that we might actually see an increase in use of force. But this is why we need evaluation, right? We need studies to be digging into this and figuring out how to do this well. Next up is ShotSpotter. These are gunshot sensors. The policy problem here is that gun violence is drastically underreported in the United States. And then 911 callers usually can't tell exactly where the gunfire happened. They can tell you they heard it somewhere nearby, but that could be blocks away. So ShotSpotter sets up acoustic sensors around some neighborhood of a city and is able to detect the sound of gunfire and triangulate the location of it so they can send that information to the police so the cops can get to the scene very quickly. The cost is about $200,000 per year to cover 3 square miles. And there are a lot of potential benefits here. It could reduce gun violence by increasing the probability that shooters get caught. It could improve the trust between residents and police by sending alerts to the cops. The cops have an opportunity to get to go to that neighborhood and knock on doors and have a positive interaction with residents who didn't trust them enough to call them. And we also know that it generates really highly accurate data on the full universe of gunshots, which I, as a researcher, find very cool, and I'm very excited about that. So the question is, does it work? There have been no evaluations of its impact on gun violence or community trust. Certainly not due to lack of pleading by people like me. I think police departments are constantly looking for evidence on this tool and others and are frustrated that no other departments have done an evaluation, but they tend not to want to do an evaluation themselves. We also know the data are available, but most cities' contracts give the full data ownership rights to the firm, which wants to sell the data to researchers and others. So we don't even get that. So in this case, with ShotSpotter, it's very unclear what cities are getting for their money. The last case study I'll give you is a plug of my own current project. I'm working with Ben Castleman at the University of Virginia to address the problem of prisoner reentry. So in the United States, about 2/3 of those released from prison will be rearrested within 3 years. We're obviously failing to help the incarcerated population reintegrate into society successfully. And unfortunately, we have essentially no evidence on how to do that better. So Ben and I are partnering with an ed tech firm called Adovo that offers tablet-based education in jails and prisons, which is an interesting intervention on its own. But we are creating a reentry module that inmates would use pre-release to answer a series of very simple questions to direct them toward personalized resources in the community for when they get out. And then after they get out, we'll send them text messages to help them stick to that plan and get the help they need. We're going to implement this as an RCT so that we're able to measure the impacts and compare the costs and benefits. So going forward, how should we be thinking about all these new tools? Many policies are implemented in a way that make evaluation difficult or impossible. This is not specific to criminal justice. This is not specific to technology. This is a policy problem. We need something like randomization, like a staggered rollout across neighborhoods, like strict cutoffs in who's treated, maybe by age or neighborhood boundaries or risk assessment scores. We tend not to have that right now. The police departments don't demand it, taxpayers don't demand it. Ideally, the police departments would bring in academic partners early on so they can help them implement it in a way to figure out what they're getting for their money. It would be great if governments made funding conditional on doing an evaluation. That would be one easy fix. And in general, my favorite soapbox issue now is that all the contracts should make sure that taxpayers own the data that they're buying, that they're paying for. So I will stop there and pass the clicker to the next speaker.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm happy to be part of this panel. I want to present you with taxonomy of legal and policy issues relating to police and technology. Because I think that stepping back and thinking about technology more broadly can teach us some important lessons. This isn't the first time in history that policing is considering how quickly and in what ways to adopt new technology. We've been doing this for a long time. Policing today, in many ways, is shaped by decisions made a long time ago about what kind of technologies to adopt and how to adopt them. And so that's why I want to give you a structure for thinking about. I'm going to talk about two different kinds of issues that get raised with respect to policing and technology, 6 different technological domains that we need to kind of keep our eyes on, and then 4 particular kinds of risks to be wary of. I'm not going to talk much about the benefits of technology, not because I don't think that they exist, but because for reasons I'll explain, I think that the benefits of technology tend to be well appreciated. The risks are more likely to be underappreciated. And unlike Rick, I don't believe that the principal danger we face is that police may not be adopting technologies quickly enough. So when new technologies come along, police face 2 different kinds of decisions. They have to figure out how to adapt to those technologies, and they have to figure out in what ways and to what extent to adopt those new technologies themselves. Other people are using technologies. People out in society are using guns or cars or means of surveillance or explosives. The police need to figure out how to react to that. The police also need to decide to what extent they're going to use the technologies. And they have made these decisions and are making these decisions historically across 6 different domains. First, and probably most consequential for the way policing works today, is transportation. So police get around in all kinds of ways. They use helicopters sometimes. They use bicycles sometimes. But the technological innovation that has shaped policing more than any other is the patrol car. When police started to get into cars in the early 20th century and started to use cars as part of their day-to-day operations, it shaped the way policing is done in ways I'll talk about a little later. The second domain that we need to keep our eyes on is communication. The police have to react to the fact that people are communicating in different ways. When people started to use telephones to plan crimes, the police needed to figure out how to react to that. When social media begins to generate criminal activity as it's doing today, the police need to figure out how to react to that. The police themselves also adopt telecommunications activity. They adopted a radio dispatch system in the early 20th century around the same time that they were putting most officers into cars. That heavily shapes the way policing is done today. Um, today, uh, police are beginning to experiment with using social media as a communications device. They are using personal electronic devices and laptops in patrol cars to communicate, and that shapes the way policing is done. With weaponry as well, police react to people developing new weapons, and police can't stand still when criminals start to have more powerful firepower, and they don't stand still. The police themselves react by arming themselves more heavily, and they sometimes arm themselves more heavily in ways that are designed to help them even in situations where they're dealing with people who aren't armed in particularly advanced ways. So police today have flash bombs that they use to execute search warrants. They have assault rifles that they use. They have robots equipped with bombs, and they have tasers. Tasers are one of the most extraordinary commercial success stories, certainly of the last couple decades. In the year 2000, about 7% of police departments in the United States had tasers or other electronic control weapons. By 2013, upwards of 80% of them did. And I'm sure today the figure is even higher. Um, there are technologies of protection. These include armored vehicles and another remarkable success story that shaped modern policing, Kevlar. So Kevlar is something we now take for granted, but it was a huge innovation. It's had an enormous effect on policing. This is a fabric that DuPont developed in 1971. It's soft and lightweight, and it can stop a .38 caliber lead bullet. Um, Police officers killed on the job per 100,000 officers in the mid-1970s averaged about 20 to 25 per year. That figure steadily declined throughout the 1980s and 1990s to today's rate, which is somewhere between 5 and 10 officers per year killed per 100,000 officers. Not all of this is a result of Kevlar, but a lot of it was. In fact, 2008 review contracted by the Department of Justice concluded that Kevlar had saved the lives of over 3,000 officers. So that's a significant development that shaped policing in good ways. Um, there are technologies of surveillance. These include wiretaps and other forms of electronic surveillance. They include shop spotter and cameras mounted in public spaces. They include techniques of self-surveillance, like dash cams or body cams on police officers that help monitor not only what the police are seeing, but how the police themselves act. Finally, there are technologies of data processing. Data processing can create new risks that the police have to deal with, like cybercrime. But it also enables computerized storage and searching of data like DNA profiles. It enables new tactics like predictive policing and intelligence-led policing, which are efforts to use computerized algorithms and statistics to predict where crimes are likely to happen and when, and to predict which people are most likely to commit crimes. So those are 6 domains along which the police have to think about how are they reacting to new technologies and how are they adopting new technologies. And I think that when the police are thinking about this and when we're thinking about this with them, there are 4 different kinds of harms that it's good to keep in mind. So the first is physical. So several dozen people per year killed by tasers in the United States. The Guardian counted 50 people killed by tasers in 2015, 22, and 2016. Amnesty International counted more than 500 from 2001 through 2012. Now, if tens of thousands of lives are being saved every year by tasers, then the few dozen lives that are lost wouldn't matter much. But the Stanford Center for Criminal Justice did a comprehensive review of research on tasers 2 years ago and was not able to confirm that tasers substituted for bullets as opposed to giving the police a tool that they use in circumstances where they otherwise wouldn't be using a firearm. So that matters a lot. Um, the victims of taser deaths are also disproportionately members of racial minority. Actually, the disproportionality here is even greater, apparently, than it is with regard to deaths from police more generally. So if using the Guardian statistics, for example, for 2015 and 2016, African Americans were a quarter of all victims uh, of police killings of civilians, but 1/3 of taser deaths. So I think physical harm is a huge thing we need to keep our eyes on when we're talking about giving the police any new kinds of technology. Second, we need to think about intangible harms, like harms to privacy, dignity. And as I think, as Jennifer indicated, a lot of the devil here is in the details, that who controls the camera footage, who decides when the cameras are being turned on, how they're going to be used, who controls the footage. Um, Third, I think we need to think about social harms from new technologies, which are easy to overlook. So it's true, as Chief Jones pointed out, that there are lots and lots of definitions of community policing, which was widely embraced, I think, for good reasons in the 1980s and the 1990s as the most important agenda for police reform. Lots of people, including me, continue to think that community policing is the best idea to come along for policing in decades. Um, there are lots of definitions of community policing, but one huge part of community policing, no matter who you ask, was, as Chief Jones says, getting cops out of patrol cars. So it was in a lot of ways a dialing back of two technological revolutions in policing: the automotive revolution and the radio dispatch revolution. Um, in addition to trust and cooperation that can be eroded by the use of new technology. And by the way, that's an issue that's also raised, I think, by the adoption of military technology by police departments. There's been an enormous spread of military-style technology to police departments. A lot of that equipment does have useful purposes, but I also think it's almost, well, I think the evidence is very strong that that technology was spread too widely, adopted more than it needed to be, and when you send your police officers down the street in an armored personnel carrier, that sends a certain message to the community, and it interferes with some of the trust and cooperation that chiefs like Chief Jones are trying to prove. Um, Another social harm that you need to be worried about is chilling political activity. This is a huge issue, obviously, associated with collection of more surveillance data, whether from body cams or any other mechanism. There is a social harm involved in reinforcing racial hierarchy and inequality. The fact that tasers tend to get used disproportionately against members of racial minorities is a huge and important problem. Um, Algorithms that tell police officers how to use their discretion can embed racial hierarchy by providing a sort of feedback loop. If the police are using data processing algorithms that depend on records they have of people who have been involved in criminal activity before, and that database is disproportionately minority, that's going to direct the police resources and the attention of police officers to members of racial minorities. And it can perpetuate a hyper focus on members of racial minorities um, in ways that can reinforce patterns of racial hierarchy and inequality. Um, Beyond social harms, I think we need to think about systemic harms of technology. Racial bias is a kind of systemic harm, but I have in mind other ways in which adopting technologies can shape the way that policing works. Um, it can monopolize police officers' time. That's what happened with the 911 dispatch system. It can soak up money that can be used for police training or other purposes. And it can distract attention at the managerial and the line level from non-technological aspects of policing. Um, the most important technology that the police have is the most important technology they've always had, and it is talk. And good police officers are officers that know how to talk and know how to listen. That's not all a police officer needs, but it's a huge part of how good police officers do their work. And attention paid to gadgets can be attention not paid to communication. So I focus on harms and not benefits of new technology because, as I said at the outset, I think that the benefits are more likely to take care of themselves. Police are like a lot of us, they like technology. Patrol officers like getting technology. Police executives like to purchase it. It is sexy, it is fun, it is more attractive in many ways than telling and figuring out how you're going to have a meeting in some church basement on a Thursday evening. And I think the spread of military surplus weaponry over the last couple decades went too far in part for those reasons. That's whole. That's even without the profit motive. But the fact is that you can make a lot of money from selling technology to police departments. Um, and Axon is a publicly traded company. There's nothing wrong with being a publicly traded company. There's nothing wrong with trying to make money. But that's that's what a publicly traded company does. And there are lots of ways for publicly traded companies to make money selling technology to police. There are many fewer ways for publicly traded companies or any companies to make money by telling police to go slower in adopting technology, or by telling the police to pay more attention to non-technological aspects of policing, like talk and ways of building community trust. So that's another reason. I think that the combination of the inherent fascination with technology and the profit motive mean that by and large, the benefits of technology are much less likely to get overlooked than the risks of technology, particularly, I'd say, the less tangible risks, including the social and systemic harms that I've discussed.
So Jennifer spoke a bit about evaluating technologies and the pros and cons of various technologies. And so if I were a city council member and my police chief comes to me and says, I want to acquire this new technology, what sorts of things should I be thinking about? And if there are technologies that resist evaluation or that are currently unevaluated, how do I go about making that decision? And should we even consider technologies that aren't evaluated in a rigorous way yet?
I think we have to consider technologies that haven't been rigorously evaluated because most haven't. I think the first step for whichever police department is trying to make a decision is to figure out what your goals are. Be very clear about what you're hoping to get out of whatever tool or whatever policy you're trying to implement, and then to have a plan for figuring out whether you've met that goal. And that's something that I think most police departments, I talk to police departments most often about ShotSpotter. It feels like almost every month another police department or journalist in the local city is calling and asking what we know and do we have any new evidence on whether it works, and we still have no evidence. And I think most police departments just view it as a hassle. I think that it's less resistance from the technology to being evaluated and more from the police department, the jurisdiction. Technology, the firms, I agree. There's nothing wrong with firms trying to make money off of this. It's great. It drives innovation. It will lead to a lot of great new products. But it's on taxpayers and on the police departments and cities to demand that we know what we're getting for the money we're spending. And so I think once taxpayers and police departments start demanding a rigorous evidence that whatever tool is adopted works, then we'll start seeing more evaluations.
I'd also want to know, I think the city council should ask, why are you focusing on this? Why is this the way and what you're wanting to do with your time, as opposed to something else you could be doing? Why is this why have you picked this? And is there somebody who's trying to sell this to you? If there is, tell me something more about them and about your relationship with them.
Gotcha. So first, I appreciate very clearly as a publicly traded company, even before we were public, entrepreneurs solve problems with the intention of capturing some of the value of what they solve. I think there's no shame in that. And in fact, I think it's driven most of the innovation in this country. But I do have to call you on one thing. This quoting The Guardian statistics that there are hundreds of people who've been killed by Taser exacerbates sort of the sensationalism that can create a negative backlash. And let me just give you one extreme example. Last year, over 100,000 people died after riding in ambulances. Now, I don't think any of us would make the cognitive leap that ambulances killed 100,000 people. When tasers are used, yes, they have killed people, around 20. The reason I want to challenge this is in many cases where tasers are used, things have happened where the taser fails and they ultimately get shot with a gun or simultaneously shot with a gun. Those numbers end up in those same numbers because it's frankly more spectacular to talk about tasers because they're new. Or in many cases, they're drug overdoses where someone has taken a lethal overdose of cocaine and is frankly exhibiting really violent behavior. So when I give you the number of less than 20, you know, we've worked with the former Surgeon General, the former president of the American Heart Rhythm Society, looking at these cases. And I just think it's important to understand that there tends to be a bit of an explosion around the risks that gets validated. Because if you actually look at the academic studies, the ones where there's actually tasers have caused death are really dramatically smaller than what you see in the public media. So I think we need to be a little bit careful. And I would encourage anybody who's here who's really interested in this topic to consider also doing a ride-along with police officers to really sort of understand sort of the environments that they're operating within. Because I think we tend to take a very negative view based on what we see about police in the media, when in fact, you know, I think if you really want to understand this, you can't just look at it from afar, but actually engaging and seeing sort of the nature of the job that's done. And I think you'd understand, you know, pretty quickly where the role of things like tasers, where, you know, certainly, and if you actually go through our training, we do train a lot of officers, we push very strongly some of the de-escalation tactics. Because frankly, if our product gets abused, the economic incentive for us to avoid that is that we get sued when that happens. And our litigation budget for many years was larger than our R&D budget. So if you actually dig in, there's significant incentives to make sure these things are used responsibly. But certainly, you know, I love the idea of having more independent analysis because I clearly have a dog in this fight.
Rick, I'm just, are you saying that less than 20 people have been killed by tasers ever anywhere in the world?
Yes.
So
I'd be happy to sit with you and take you through the case by case.
Well, I'd love that because I count 9 already this year in the United States. I think that I think that one thing your company
You're saying 9 have died after taser use. That's very different from being killed by a taser.
Yeah, that's true. And I maybe part of what you're saying is something I know your company has said in the past. Sometimes your company has said that you shouldn't count something as a taser death if it was the result of a misuse of the taser.
No, I'm not counting. I'm including
I think
misuses.
maybe we should, since the panel is not on tasers, maybe we should get to some of the other questions. And I think it would be great to continue this discussion during the break. But
You can suck the air out of the room quick.
all three of you spoke to some degree about the problems raised by new technologies, and you know, so what are the range of solutions to minimizing these problems? And you know, I'm thinking there's the development of the product. Could something be done there? The marketing of the product, acquisition, the training, as you mentioned, Rick, the use of the product. Where along this continuum are the key points for example, reducing deaths from tasers, or in the other technologies that Jennifer spoke about?
Well, I can only speak for things like deaths from tasers. A lot of it does come down to training. For example, the number one cause of death is actually related to falling injuries. And we've had a few where, you know, using a taser where someone is near an elevated height where they can fall. You know, it may sound obvious, but it's something that we've had to reinforce over and over again in training to try to avoid those things. Or another one, and it might sound a little obvious here, but if someone has doused themselves in a flammable liquid, we've had several people that have been ignited by police using a taser. So I think those are some of the areas where you obviously want to make sure you're reinforcing those issues over and over. And then the other point I would make as well is I think they've raised a very good point that there is a risk that officers go right to the technology rather than using other skills, verbal skills. And you know, we're very cognizant and agree there's a risk of overuse. And that's frankly one of the reasons that we did get into the body camera business, was to be able to provide more accountability and less incentive for people to use things in a way that's not fully justified.
So one thing I think is really important is just the initial contract language and the negotiation process up front. And it's definitely not the sexiest part of the process, but it winds up being really important in figuring out or determining what a local jurisdiction is getting. And I think the main problem is that most police departments just don't have the expertise or resources in-house to know even what questions to ask. I think I mentioned the data ownership issue, and that's a prime example. Police departments, I talk a lot about how important it is to make sure they own the data, and police chiefs will say, well, but we just don't have the resources to manage all those data. It's better for ShotSpotter to do that, or whatever firm. And just communicating that data ownership doesn't necessarily mean data management, that there are differences there, I think is really important, and there's certainly an educational component here. So whether that's, it's probably unlikely that every police department is going to have like a tech expert in-house, but every city government could. And this is certainly, the adoption of technology is not unique to criminal justice, so it would be useful in other agencies across cities, or even just having more guidance from the nonprofit sector or from the federal government about kind of standard contract language, what questions to ask during that process.
I would actually just add in real quick that one thing you could consider is there's groups like PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, and the ICP that could use exactly that guidance, where maybe if there was, because I happen to agree on that one, that when you've got this fragmented an industry with many small agencies, they don't have the expertise, and I think that's a really good point, but sometimes you can use some of the industry groups to sort of provide guidelines, et cetera, or almost stamps of approval on different contracts so that agencies don't have to figure it out for themselves.
I'd say it's also important to keep in mind that technologies get used by human beings. But, police officers are humans, and the way in which the impact of the technology is going to be the impact that it has when it's actually used, and not the impact that it would have if it was used perfectly. So the Taser company has instructed people, for example, that Tasers are not supposed to be used against people who are drunk or under the influence of psychotropic drugs. That's a very disproportionate share of the number of the people who actually get Tasers used on them. 10 of the people who were killed by Tasers by the police in 2015 were handcuffed or shackled at the time. That's not a proper use of the Taser. It's not one that the Taser company wants the police to engage in. But when you put, when a technology is adopted, it's going to get implemented by human beings.
Again, I would like to just comment on there. We don't train officers not to shoot people that are under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And the reason we don't is that sort of highly definitive statement from a manufacturer is inappropriate because we're not there on the scene. There may be times where you have somebody who's high on drugs and who's extremely violent where the Taser may be the best alternative to be chosen. So we do try to discourage it, but I just wanted to be, sort of make that clarifying point. We have to be a little bit careful that we can't have black and white dictums coming from the manufacturer.
Well, I'm glad you've changed that because the old instructions...
That was not a change.
So training is really important, is what I'm hearing. Training and the acquisition contracts is what people should really pay attention to when trying to mitigate these problems. Great. Let's see. So let's talk more about private companies coming into law enforcement, right? So as Rick mentioned, private companies are expanding from products to services, right? So with evidence.com, with the cloud storage where the body cam footage is stored, I think automatic license plate readers, companies that offer those have a similar setup. There's social media surveillance companies that are expanding into the law enforcement space. So what sorts of legal or other issues crop up when private companies take on this service role of storing or analyzing data, for example, with the AI that's coming into evidence.com?
Yeah, certainly it does raise questions certainly about how you implement this. There are a number of accreditations that help with that. For example, we're ISO 27001 certified, which is a security certification. We're about to be FedRAMP certified, which is the new federal guidelines for housing any federal data. So I think this is, again, where industry standards or complying with certain certifications or sort of watchdog type guidelines are really important. So not to sort of be braggadocious, but for example, this idea about the data, the companies owning the data, in our case, we have in our contracts, it's very clear that we can't own the data because in our case, ownership of criminal records would create an enormous, not only a legal problem for our customers, but for us as well. But there are other cases where those legal guidelines are maybe not as clear, and that's where I think there does need to be some really clear guideline at some sort of either state or larger level, because trying to address this at 18,000 individual agencies would be really hard, and really, I think, almost impossible. So you need something happening at a higher level.
Yeah, and just to continue on that point and go back to the data ownership issues, I think kind of from a policy perspective, my concern with a lot of with these firms owning the data, and in general, I think it's great the police departments and other types of government agencies are outsourcing these services to tech firms. I think it's great to bring in that expertise and the innovation and all of that. But in practice, what winds up happening is if the firm does own the data, the police department is able to avoid public records law or get around public records law by outsourcing a service and data collection to a private firm. And that is something that I worry about just setting a precedent for when this will inevitably continue in the future. But sometimes it's because the police department just doesn't know what they're signing. Sometimes they're very happy with that deal because they'd rather the taxpayers not see the data that are collected. But that's something I think as citizens we should all be really concerned about.
So when Axon decided to start offering body cameras for free, did it consider the privacy concerns of that step, or was that a concern that you viewed as properly the domain of the municipalities that would be acquiring the body cameras, right? Like who has that responsibility? And that's open to all of the panelists.
I'll start off. So yes, so there's a couple of reasons we offered the body cameras at no charge. Ultimately, what we've seen is today, for all the push for body cameras and transparency, only about 20% of police officers today have one. So even if there's a tremendous alignment, and my other product, the Taser, is slightly more controversial. For example, folks like the ACLU are very negative on the Taser, which is highly supported by police. But we've seen body cameras, there's broad alignment where the ACLU has actually been pushing for the use of body cameras. But even with that broad alignment, just the sort of inertia of budgeting cycles, and we actually get down to doing something at city government level as these things take time. So we looked at this as an opportunity to accelerate the market forward. And yes, indeed, ultimately the business model for us is about building the network of services that connects the data, sort of like the cell phone industry. So this would be like if early on the smartphone industry was seeing that it was happening slower, they might say, we're going to give you a free trial for a year to accelerate people into it. We think a body camera for a cop is all like a smartphone. Now, in terms of the privacy issues, I don't really know that the free cameras changes that at all. We already support over half of the major cities in the US are using our evidence.com service. So frankly, we already have to deal with those privacy issues, whether it's paid or not paid. So from our perspective, the way we try to approach this by being very, very transparent with our customers, that our business model is you pay us for a service, we run the service, but this is not a data monetization play where many free services we use, like Google, for example, the reason they're free is the monetization is from the use of the data. So I think it's, as you pointed out, when you do have a profit motive, I think it's best if you can very clearly define and transparently align, okay, here's the way our interests operate, and here are the steps we're taking to make sure that our interests aren't running counter to the interest of the, the user agency.
I mean, one thing I'll just add to that, and I think, as I mentioned during my presentation, body-worn cameras are an exception to this rule that we have no evaluation. I think it's wonderful that, I guess I worry less about the idea that, police departments will be incentivized to try this out because there is so much ongoing evaluation. These cameras are being rolled out as RCTs. I know DC is currently doing one. We're going to have plenty of evidence on whether they're working and when they're working and how to get them to work better. And so if we had more of that, then I think these other issues would become less and less relevant.
I'd actually love to help connect you with more agencies as well.
Let's talk.
I would agree that better data is more helpful.
All right. So turning to the future, where is the technology going in the policing space, right? What are some of the developments that are happening, and what are some of the promises and issues that these new technologies are bringing up?
Happy to comment. I don't want to dominate here.
I can, so so one thing I think is really interesting is the impact of the various prediction tools that are being developed, both predictive policing, risk assessment tools. I think there are a lot of data scientists who are thinking quite seriously about how to make prediction better. As a social scientist, I want to know, does it matter if we get the prediction better? And what's the impact on racial disparities in sentencing, on incarceration rates, and so on, if a judge gets to see a risk assessment score or not? I know there are police departments who are also trying to do prediction to try to figure out who the problem officers are and be able to identify and flag those sooner. And so being able to know what the impact of that is on these issues we've been talking about today. I think there are a lot of really exciting developments in a variety of areas, but those are a few I have my eye on.
So I would say, so with these two AI acquisitions we just made, there was a lot of interest that I mentioned around like facial recognition technology. And one of the things that we're doing is we formed an AI, or in the process of forming an AI ethics and privacy advisory board in order to advise us before, like right now we're not working on any facial recognition technology, although just because we're not doing doesn't mean nobody else will. And so we see an opportunity to help set the bar and do this the right way, because I don't think we can expect that police will not use technology. When technology is pervasive through society, and your iPhoto and Facebook is using really advanced facial recognition technology, I think the idea that we'll just say, no, the police aren't going to use it is not realistic. So I think it's really important how it's introduced and how it's used. And again, from the company perspective, our incentive to do this is not just mom and apple pie, but it is reputational. Like as you get to a certain level of success, and we've built a successful business, at this point we have a very strong interest in doing this in a way that protects our reputation, because obviously if we do it the wrong way, the possibility of a backlash that wipes this technology out and makes it unavailable is significant. So I think there's a little bit of a, as you do get bigger and more entrenched, there's actually stronger and stronger incentives to make sure you're aligning with the public interest so you don't destroy what you build.
All right. So let's turn now to questions from the audience. Right there, I think.
When you started, you showed a bullet and you said, killing is a technology, Rick, that is a technological limitation and it'll be solved within a decade. Can you say how?
Yeah, great question. I mean, ultimately, when I say it's a technology limitation, with the exception of people with very criminal intent, killing is only justified as an ends to getting a situation under control. I'm not aware of any sort of justification for why a police officer in particular would kill someone if it's not to stop a threat. So if we had the Star Trek phaser today and it was 100% reliable and I could point it and it had the same or greater range than a Glock police pistol and it immediately stopped somebody, I think, and I've been talking about this with police chiefs and officers on the street, and I've been shocked at how receptive they are to this idea that if they could do the job without killing someone, they absolutely want to do that. Now, of course, that's our core mission. Where we're at today, the technology we develop actually is faster in time to incapacitation than a bullet in laboratory conditions. And I'm sorry, this is going to maybe get a little uncomfortable, but if you actually think about what a bullet does, it tears enormous wounds in flesh. But FBI statistics show that even if you shoot someone in the center of mass with a kill shot, they can return fire and operate for about 14 seconds. So in fact, unless you hit the central nervous system of the body and destroy the brain, people can fight back. We've all heard stories of people in war that have limbs blown off and horrific injuries, and actually that doesn't necessarily stop the threat. One thing that gets me so excited about electricity as a mechanism, because the human nervous system is a command and control system, you can take it down immediately without causing injury. Again, there can be some secondary injuries, and it's certainly not risk-free, but I think we can do it at a far lower level of risk than you can with lead bullets.
I think we had a question right there. Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
Hi. So I do research on police killings, and I'm extremely familiar with the Guardian data, and I tend to fall, I'm very much on David's side at this point, but I wanted to bring up just a couple of things that I think I see as flags while I'm going through these cases and as I'm looking at these deaths related by tasers. First of all, the 50 taser-related deaths are strictly tasers. There's another about 15 to 10% of the shooting cases where the taser was used first, either did not incapacitate the person, and then they were shot. So those are the taser cases are strictly taser cases. And I think this semantic of saying, oh, well, it's not the taser that's killing them is kind of the same thing as if you said, you know, somebody was hit by a car, 3 days later they died in the hospital. Like, oh, was it really the car? Well, yes. But one thing is because I see it as I'm reading, and I read the coroner reports, I'm going through all these cases in depth, is that the blame for these deaths seems to mostly be put on intoxication, or they were intoxicated with drugs or alcohol at the time, and it's kind of it's like almost treated as like a bug in the system of like this is an abnormal situation. But the fact of the matter is, the police are continually engaging with people who are intoxicated. I mean, about 20% of the total deaths I see were cases where somebody was intoxicated. I used to do interviews in jails in Maricopa County, and about 25 to 30% of the people I was interviewing were high at the time that I was interviewing them. So, I mean, rather than treating this as a bug in the system, it seems to be that you need to be designing around the fact that the police are going to come in contact with about a third of people who are, you know.
Okay, yeah, so first of all, let me say this. Because we don't have forever, you know, I'm gonna have to be precise in my comments. Some of this may sound heartless because we're talking science. All of these loss of lives are tragic for the people involved and the families. But now we're talking about causality. The difference is when you get hit by a car and you die 3 days later in the hospital, there's a very clear connection about the injuries from the vehicle. What's happening in these cases that you're referring to is police may hit somebody with a taser and they may die hours or days later. And the allegation is that the taser caused ventricular fibrillation, for example. It is a very well known, there are thousands of medical studies on ventricular fibrillation caused by electricity. It is an immediate phenomenon. So it can't happen that you get shocked right now and you have VF from the electrical charge 2 hours later. And in many of those cases, and I'm not saying that this is not a judgment that the people deserved something. Not at all. But what I'm saying is in many of these cases, there are toxic levels of drugs in the system, and the method in which they die is very consistent with people who go through the exact same thing where no taser is used. I think in that case, to say we have several cases following the same symptom pattern with the same mechanism of death, and there's a taser used over here, and there's not a plausible scientific mechanism by which this taser would have caused the death 2 hours later, and we have an alternative, highly plausible case that's happened in other cases where taser is not related, those still tend to get lumped together into taser-related deaths. And again, I'm not telling you that tasers haven't killed people, but I think people tend to jump in cases where you can pretty strongly exclude it. And yet they still say, well, since taser was the only force used by police, therefore it was the thing that caused the death. And the unfortunate outcome of this, look, this is the city of San Francisco has been trying to deploy tasers for about 10 years, 4 successive police chiefs. During that time period, I think they've documented over 10 people they've shot and killed that were very highly, these were perfect taser use cases. We've not been able to get tasers into the city of San Francisco because of this issue where I think there's an exaggerated perception of the risk. And so police are now going on the street in San Francisco with guns and still no option of the taser. So I'm all for the control and the oversight. And I'd be happy to sit with you afterwards and go through, we spend a lot of money on medical research to try to reduce those risks. But I think we just need to also be careful that we don't over-calibrate and leave cops with nothing but sticks and guns.
I think that a good number of the San Francisco deaths weren't perfect instances for the use of a taser. They were perfect instances for the use of patients and talking people down. Because a number of these cases were cases of people that were armed only with knives. We have lots and lots of people shot every year by the police who have knives, and almost no police officers are ever killed by anybody with a knife. The police for decades have been training officers that once somebody gets within 21 feet of you with a knife, you're not going to be able to stop them with by shooting them. There's zero evidence for that. There are no other industrialized countries that kill people as often when they just have knives. There are crazy people with knives in Britain, in Germany, shouldn't say crazy people. There are people with knives, sometimes with mental disabilities in Germany, in the UK. They don't tend to get killed. And it's not because the police use tasers. It's because they de-escalate. Wait.
Actually, I find myself in the awkward position of agreeing with you, which is going to make this less interesting for the audience. Yeah, in fact, one of the things that we're doing right now is we're actually revamping our training, and we're actually trying to bring in expertise from the United Kingdom because you have a very valid point. In the United Kingdom, if you step towards an officer with a knife, the officer backs up. If you step towards an officer with a knife in the United States, chances are you get shot and killed. So we are trying to bring some of those techniques in. I mean, the Brits do also use tasers, but you're right, they do have probably better de-escalation techniques, and there's lots of room for improvement there.
So just one thing to add here, I feel like we can talk in circles about this for days, and ultimately it's an empirical question, right? This is something where you want an experiment. You want one place that just has guns and batons, one place that does some innovative new training program with de-escalation, and one place that has tasers, and see what happens. And the closer we can get to experiments like that, I think the better off we'll be.
There actually was one interesting experiment we'll share with you where what happened was a city that had tasers actually moved them much higher on their use of force threshold. So they went from having them to then having them largely not available, and there were actually interesting pre and post changes. Unfortunately, I can't remember all the details, but I'll give them to you afterwards.
Last question. Sure.
Maybe for Jennifer Doliak. Why doesn't the fragmentation issue that you described lead to a conclusion that the municipality should not own that data? If I am the city council of Lone Pine, the use of the value of that data to me is not zero. I mean, there is, it's nice to know when my technology has been used. But most of the value is part of a larger fabric that would extend over the entire state, for example, or some much larger area. Why isn't the appropriate solution a state law that requires the technology company and the municipality to contract to convey the rights and the information to the state, and for both to have an obligation to transmit it so that something can actually be done with it? Isn't that where your conclusion goes? Because it's off your analysis, because presumably the technology companies like it or like to own it because there's more concentration at the provider level than at the municipality level. There are only a few companies that are doing this technology, and so if they scarf up all the information they've got, they can collect it. But really, it would be even more valuable on a state level or some trans-state level.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really care which government owns it. I think I'm mostly concerned that if the taxpayers are paying to collect some data, the taxpayers own the data. I think the private firms in general.
What difference does it make if Lone Pine owns it if they can't do anything with it?
The private firm, or you're talking the government?
The town. I mean, if Lone Pine contracts with Axon and ends up owning a bit of that then cannot be stitched into the skein of data for the state of California to require to actually detect whatever trends are popping up, because it's certainly not going to be apparent from the free uses in Lone Pine, right? Wouldn't you want that to be sort of part of a larger corpus of data that could actually be processed?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if each individual municipality owned their data and it became public record, then someone could go out and collect the data from all the different places. I'm not opposed to having the state gather those data. I think that would be a nice public service for the state to do. But ultimately, I mean, part of this is a principle and a precedent that we're setting about who should own data the taxpayers are paying for. And in the particular instances we're talking about, these data are valued to the taxpayers and journalists, and it provides a sense of transparency to know what taxpayers are getting for the money that they're spending on whatever service the private firm is providing.
All right. Well, that is the end of our time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.